They called her a liar when she was 15. She never argued, just wrote one letter, folded it into a crack behind a window frame. 25 years later, someone found it, not to confront, just to finally understand. This is a story about Eleanor, a woman who returned to her childhood home after her mother's passing, not for closure, not to make peace, just to pack a few things, maybe open a window. But memory has its own way of unfolding, especially when the wind blows through something left behind. The wind doesn't blow the way I remember. I came back on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day where the air feels thick with memory but thin with conversation. The clouds hung low over the old neighborhood, not threatening rain, just watching. I parked at the end of the narrow driveway, cracked now, sprouting weeds in the places my brother used to chalk lines for stickball. The house hadn't changed in the way some things don't. Same peeling white siding, same creak in the front steps, same tilt in the mailbox that my mother used to prop with a rock. But something in it felt smaller, like a once loud voice now whispering through closed doors. Or maybe I'd just grown too far from who I was when I left. The key didn't quite fit at first. I had to jiggle it like I used to back when I'd sneak in past curfew, hoping not to wake my mother. Strange how muscle memory remains long after the emotion it used to serve fades away. Inside, the air smelled of dust and lavender, an odd combination that felt like a sigh held for too long. The house had been sold years ago, passed on to strangers who never moved in. An administrative glitch, someone said. A bureaucratic gift, someone else said. Either way, it gave me this one strange window of time before the new owners arrived, to clear out what was left. The walls were bare. My mother had never been one for pictures. She kept memories in things, mismatched teacups, doilies, old cookbooks with butter stains on every other page. I walked through the hallway slowly, trailing my fingers along the grooves of the wainscoting, half expecting to hear her voice from the kitchen calling me a silly girl for touching the paint. I paused at the doorway of my childhood bedroom. It was smaller than I remembered, just like everyone always says, but it really was. The bed was gone, the dresser too, but the window remained, the one that faced the sycamore tree and caught the morning sun if I opened it just right. It was the window where I used to sit on the sill, knees to my chest, writing in journals that no one read, that no one believed. They used to call me a liar. It started with small things, missing keys, a broken lamp, then bigger ones, money that disappeared, accusations I never understood. I stopped trying to explain. They stopped trying to listen. Somewhere along the way, I became the girl who made things up. And once you're labeled that, truth becomes a shadow you can't hold. Now, I stood in that same room, older, quieter, unsure of what I was meant to feel. The wind pushed softly against the window pane. I reached out and opened it. It stuck halfway, probably warped from time, but the breeze still found its way in, brushing against my cheek like something familiar trying to say hello. There was silence. Not the heavy kind, but the kind that waits, patient and full of space. And maybe, just maybe, I had come back not to explain myself, but to listen. I don't know exactly when the shift happened. From being a curious, talkative child to the one they called unreliable. Maybe it was gradual, like water warming in a pot, until one day I realized I was boiling in mistrust. When I was 8, I told my mother that someone had let the cat out. She scolded me for blaming others. When I was 10, I swore I saw my brother steal cash from her purse. He denied it. She believed him. And by 12, the only thing I could do was stay quiet or spin stories to reclaim control of the narrative, even if no one asked to hear them. By 13, they'd stopped asking anything at all. I wrote instead. On scraps of paper, margins of notebooks, in the backs of library books I knew no one would check out. My words didn't demand belief. They didn't need permission. They simply were. I'd sit for hours by that bedroom window, knees drawn up, pen scratching along cheap paper like it might etch the truth into something permanent. But it was that one note that mattered most. I must have been 15. We'd had a fight. The kind that wasn't loud, just heavy. My mother looked at me like I wasn't hers. My brother avoided my eyes, and I, heart stubborn and raw, slipped a folded piece of paper into the gap between the window frame and the wall. I didn't mean for anyone to find it. It wasn't for them. It was for the house, for the silence. I remember what I wrote. Not the exact words, maybe, but the feeling. I'm sorry for being the girl you couldn't believe. I'm sorry for making it easier to walk away than to listen. I'm sorry that even the truth came out sounding like a lie. I just wanted to be seen. The paper yellowed there, I imagine, through seasons of dust and wind and forgetting. In the years that followed, I left. I left with an acceptance that felt like a defeat and a determination that barely covered the cracks. I studied psychology, not to fix others, but to understand myself. To build a framework for why the people who were supposed to love you sometimes only loved the version of you they created in their heads. I built a life. Nothing extravagant. But I found clients who trusted me, colleagues who respected me, people who didn't look through me or at me sideways. And yet, I never returned. Not for holidays, not for phone calls. Not even when I heard my mother was sick. I told myself it would reopen wounds that had already scarred over. But I lied. It wasn't about reopening them. It was about admitting they never closed. I still remembered the smell of her cinnamon tea, the sharp way she clicked her tongue when annoyed, the way she softened, just slightly, when tucking in the corners of my blanket, even during the cold years between us. I remembered my brother too. He used to pull my braid and call me Professor, back when that was still a game and not a premonition. We were close once, before I started saying things no one wanted to hear, before I became a liability to the family's sense of itself. He stopped calling when I left. I stopped expecting it. And now here I was, standing again in the room that once held everything I couldn't say out loud. There was a crack in the wallpaper by the window, the same one I used to trace with my finger when I couldn't sleep. I reached out, almost unconsciously, and ran my fingers along it. My hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but recognition. Not everything had been forgotten. I spent the next hour moving slowly through the house, each step deliberate, like walking through someone else's memory that still smelled faintly like mine. The kitchen was nearly empty, just a few chipped mugs in the cabinet, a half-empty box of herbal tea that had long expired, and a small notebook with grocery lists written in my mother's handwriting. Plums, butter, brown sugar. The list ended abruptly, like a breath cut short. I didn't take anything. I couldn't. It felt like stealing from a life that no longer belonged to me. In the living room, dust floated in thick slants of afternoon light. I opened a drawer from the sideboard and found an envelope with my name on it. Not a letter, just an envelope. Empty. Untouched. As if someone had once intended to write something, then couldn't bring themselves to begin. I didn't cry. I don't know why. Maybe the years had wrung that part of me dry, or maybe I'd already cried too many times for too many things. I just folded it back the way I found it and kept moving. It wasn't until I returned to my old room that something shifted. The light had changed, becoming warmer, angled, like it used to just before dinner time when my mother would call from the bottom of the stairs and I'd pretend not to hear. I opened the window again, this time fully. The breeze pushed into the room with a soft insistence, stirring the corners of the faded curtains. I knelt beside the frame, the wood swollen slightly from years of weather. I pressed gently along the edge, remembering. And there it was. I felt it before I saw it. A thin, papery edge poking from the narrow seam where the frame met the wall. I pinched it carefully, heart caught somewhere between memory and disbelief, and pulled. The paper was dry and fragile. The ink had faded to a soft gray, but the loops of my teenage handwriting were unmistakable. I didn't need to read it to know what it said. I had written it once and rewritten it in my head 100 times since. Every word had been etched into the shape of who I became. Still, I sat cross-legged on the floor and unfolded it slowly, letting the dust dance between my fingers. I'm sorry for being the girl you couldn't believe. The words trembled as if they still weren't sure they were allowed to be heard. I closed my eyes. There was something holy about silence when it held the truth. That's when I heard footsteps on the front porch. Heavy, familiar, reluctant. I didn't move at first. I wasn't sure if I wanted to be seen in that moment, caught holding something that had never been meant for anyone else's eyes. But then I heard the key turn, and I knew. My brother stepped inside. His voice called out low and uncertain. "Hello?" I stood up slowly, folding the letter as gently as I could and slipping it into my pocket. When I met him at the hallway, his eyes widened slightly in surprise. Not because I was there, but because I wasn't supposed to be. "Didn't expect you'd come," he said. "Neither did I." He looked older, not in the way age adds wrinkles, but in the way life wears on a person from the inside. His jaw was tighter, his shoulders heavier, but his eyes, they still carried the same mix of pride and distance I remembered. "I came for Mom's locket," he said, his voice clipped. "It was the only thing she kept from Dad." "It's in her room," I said, nodding toward the back. He didn't move, just looked at me like he was trying to read a sentence that had been smudged. "You been here long? An hour, maybe?" He nodded again. "You look, well." It wasn't a compliment. Not exactly, but it also wasn't an accusation. It sat somewhere in between, like most of what had passed between us for the last 2 decades. "I found something," I said before I could stop myself. He raised an eyebrow. "What kind of something?" I hesitated, then reached into my pocket and held out the folded page. I didn't hand it to him. Just let it rest on my open palm, like an offering I wasn't sure he'd take. His gaze dropped. He stared at it for a long moment before finally taking it. He read slowly, lips pressed tight. The light from the window hit his face in half shadow. When he finished, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me, not with the confusion I expected, not with anger, not even regret, just stillness. And then he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible nod, the kind that doesn't demand resolution, only recognition. It was more than I thought I'd ever get. It was enough. We didn't speak after he read the letter. He held it a moment longer, as if his fingers were listening even more than his eyes. Then he folded it neatly, more carefully than I'd expected, and handed it back to me without a word. I didn't take it. I just let it rest on the windowsill, next to a sun-faded coaster I hadn't noticed before. It looked oddly like a gravestone for something unspoken. He moved to the bedroom he and I had shared once, long before I became difficult, before silence stretched between us like a hallway we couldn't walk down. I stayed in mine, sitting cross-legged on the floor again, listening to the faint creak of floorboards beneath his steps. The wind came back through the open window, brushing the edges of the letter as if trying to lift it again. I watched it but didn't stop it. It didn't fly away. It just shifted, half off the edge now, waiting. I heard the drawers opening, the rustle of boxes being moved, and then his voice. "It's gone." I stood and walked to the doorway. "What is?" "The locket." His tone wasn't angry, just flat, like a note held too long. "She must have given it away before the end," I offered, though I knew he wasn't really asking for an explanation. He stared at the top of the dresser as if it might conjure something he'd missed. It was the only thing she never let go of, not even after Dad left. I nodded. We both stood there, neither quite knowing how to stand near grief that had already happened without us. After a moment, he looked over at me, not directly, but enough to see that I hadn't left. "I didn't know she kept your room the same." "She didn't," I said. "This is different. Empty. But it still remembers." His brow furrowed. "Still remembers?" I smiled faintly. "That crack in the wallpaper, the smell, the way the light hits around 5, it's all memory. Not mine, it's." He didn't respond, but he walked slowly back into the hall and leaned against the door frame, arms crossed loosely. He looked at the window, the same one he'd once leaned out of to spit water at passing cars when we were kids. The same one he slammed shut when I told him about the cat dying. He hadn't believed me then either. He looked at the letter again, still resting half off the windowsill. "Was this for her?" he asked finally. I shook my head. Number it was for me. Then. And now? I met his gaze. "I don't think it matters anymore. She never saw it. But I did. And now, so have you." He rubbed the back of his neck, like he was trying to stretch a memory out of a muscle too long unused. "I used to think you made things up because you liked the attention." I nodded. "I know. But you didn't, did you?" It wasn't a question. Not really. "No," I said softly. The silence that followed was different from the ones we used to share. It didn't press or accuse. It simply was. Like an old coat that still fit, even if you hadn't worn it in years. He looked around the room again, eyes scanning the bare walls, the empty closet, the rug that had curled up at the edges. "You ever think about keeping it?" he asked. "The house?" "Yeah." I paused. "I think it kept me longer than I kept it." He almost smiled. It didn't quite reach his mouth, but the edge of something softened in him. "You still write?" I blinked. It had been a long time since someone asked me that without sarcasm. "Yes," I said, "but only what I need to." He nodded. We walked back down to the living room together, steps out of sync but close enough not to notice. He picked up the empty envelope from the drawer and looked at it like it might finally speak. "You think she meant to write something?" "I think she thought about it," I said. "Maybe she didn't know what to say. Maybe she hoped we would." He slid the envelope back in place, gently, as if it were a sleeping pet. "Are you staying long?" he asked. "Number just today." He looked like he wanted to argue with that. Or maybe he didn't. Maybe he knew that some returns aren't meant to be permanent, just necessary. Before he left, he paused at the door, hand on the knob. "Thank you," he said. For what? I wasn't sure. For the letter? For the silence? For not fighting? "You're welcome," I replied. Then he was gone. And for the first time in years, I felt like someone had heard me, even if they didn't say it out loud. After he left, I didn't move for a while. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt heavy with absence. It just existed. Like an old friend you don't need to talk to anymore, because the presence alone is enough. I walked back up to my bedroom. The letter was still there on the sill, corners lifted slightly from the breeze. I didn't touch it. I just sat on the edge of the window like I used to, legs swinging slowly, the same creak of wood beneath me. Outside, the sycamore tree had grown taller than I remembered. Its leaves shivered lightly in the wind, catching late sunlight in flashes of soft gold. I remembered watching it for hours when I was younger, pretending the rustling was a secret language I just hadn't learned yet. I let the window stay open, not out of nostalgia, but because the air felt cleaner when it passed through something old. I stayed until the light dimmed, then stood and opened the closet. It was mostly empty, just a folded blanket on the top shelf and an old shoebox pushed to the back. I pulled the box out gently. Inside were a few things I hadn't expected to see again. A broken wristwatch, a library card with my maiden name, and a tiny photo of me and my brother at some long-forgotten fair. We were holding cotton candy, both of us mid-laugh. Our eyes weren't suspicious yet. Our bodies hadn't learned to flinch. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Small, unsteady. I left the photo in the box, but I took the library card. Not because I needed it, but because something in me liked the idea of bringing a version of myself home, even if only tucked away in my wallet like a ghost. Downstairs, the light had grown amber. The house held it well, like it always had. The dust in the air looked like fireflies, and for a moment, everything seemed paused in soft suspension. I gathered what little I had set aside, the envelope, the old coaster, the shoebox. I placed them neatly on the dining table. Then I walked through the rooms one last time. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I let my footsteps be my goodbye. At the front door, I turned around and looked back. The house didn't look sad. It didn't even feel like it was saying goodbye. It just stood there, waiting for the next story it would hold. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and locked it with a kind of reverence. Then I slipped the key through the mail slot and let it fall. It made a soft sound against the floor inside. Final, but not hard. The sky had turned lavender. A single star blinked above the roofline like a quiet eye, not watching, just witnessing. I got in the car, started the engine, and rolled down the windows. As I pulled away from the curb, I glanced back once, just once, through the rearview mirror. The curtain in the upstairs window shifted. Maybe from the wind. Or maybe the house was exhaling. She never played the letter aloud, not with her voice, not with her hands, but something in her silence had spoken louder than sound ever could. I don't know what my brother took away from that afternoon, what parts of the past stayed with him, what parts fell through the cracks like dust. But I no longer needed to know. We had stood in the same room. We had let the same light fall over us. And that was enough. Sometimes forgiveness doesn't arrive in words or gestures. It comes in the way a person doesn't flinch anymore when you enter the room. In the way their eyes stop looking for who you used to be and instead hold still for who you've become. I used to think healing was something dramatic, loud, beautiful, conclusive. But this was not a triumph. It was a quiet untying, a letting go. The window I left open will close eventually. The wind will shift, the dust will settle. Someone will sweep the floor, paint the walls, call it theirs. But the house remembers, and so do I. I remember that I was once a girl who wanted to be believed, who learned to stop speaking and then spent her life helping others speak. I remember the feeling of the windowsill beneath my legs, the paper soft with time, the breeze touching my face like a memory coming home. And I remember the moment it all changed, not with an apology, not with a tear, but with a nod. Small, human, enough. If you ask me what I found in that house, I wouldn't say closure. I'd say clarity, because some things don't end, they just stop hurting. And in the stillness after, we can finally hear ourselves. Let the windows stay open, just a little longer. Let the light touch the dust without needing to clean it. Let silence mean what it has always meant. Not absence, just space.